Hello and welcome to the Mastering Blood Sugar Podcast. It's Dr. Brian Mowll, the diabetes coach. And with me here today is a good friend of mine, someone that you've heard of before because I've spoken about him and his wife, and that is Craig Emmerich. So, Craig, welcome. It's nice to have you here on the Mastering Blood Sugar Podcast. I don't think I've had you by yourself on. I know you've been on with Maria before, but really a pleasure to have you here. And we're going to talk about some really important things today.
Thank you, Brian, for having me on. It's been a minute. I think you were on our conference we did over COVID. I think
Yeah,
that
that's
was the
right.
last time we maybe chatted.
Time flies, doesn't it?
For sure.
Amazing, amazing. All right, so time flies, but time has passed. And I think as time passes, we sort of reassess sometimes how we think about things. And, we learn more. We start to understand things like diabetes and metabolic dysfunction in maybe new ways or different ways. And we were just talking a little bit before we started recording about insulin and insulin resistance, of course, is a big factor here. But, we have talked even here on this podcast before about the different mechanisms of insulin resistance, some of the things that cause insulin resistance. And one of them is hyperinsulinemia. Like many people, I think recently I've come to maybe reassess that a little bit. I think maybe that's a smaller factor than what I once thought. And I think this is important to talk about because we tend to look at our diet and carbohydrates in particular as driving, this hyperinsulin response. And then that sends us through this downward spiral into metabolic dysfunction and ultimately type 2 diabetes. But, it's definitely much more complicated than that. So I would love to hear your thoughts about this whole model, what we call the carb insulin model,
Yeah,
and how that relates to metabolic health and what your thinking is around that right now.
definitely. First of all, I just want to commend you for having that open mind to keep learning and adjusting and learning new things and bettering your our collective understanding on a lot of these topics. And I think that's kind of the downfall of some of the people in this community is they do get kind of stuck on one dogma and they're not open to seeing new developments and new understandings. But this is definitely an area that we've over 20 years of doing this, last 10 or 12 years we've kind of been shifting because we've been understanding more about the mechanisms. And I know we initially before I start we're talking about insulin, but I want to dive into actually something that is one of the real root causes of insulin resistance, which is the personal fat threshold. I think going into that first before we dive a little more into insulin might be a good side topic here. So personal fat threshold when we're young, and I actually heard about this when I was a teenager, I think, how we generally make new fat cells when we're young, like toddlers, and we get to a certain age and we just stop making lots of new fat cells and we just fill and empty the ones we have. So you fill them up or empty them. If you get more overweight, you fill them up. If you lose body fat, you shrink them. But what this creates is a scenario or a situation where, due to genetics and whatever factors, you have a certain number of fat cells on your body. And if you get too many of these fat cells stuffed, problems occur. So your fat cell is kind of like a balloon. If it gets too full and it doesn't want to burst, so the fat cell itself starts to reject insulin. It says, I don't want to take any more fat because I'm already full. Well, if you have a lot of fat cells in that state where they're like, I'm too full, I'm not taking fat anymore, what's happening to the body? It's becoming insulin resistant because the body's constantly trying to keep the fuel in the bloodstream at a good amount for the current activity level and whatnot. And if these fat cells are all saying, I'm not taking fat, but you're still eating fat in the diet, where's the fat going to go? Eventually, you run out of places to store it. And so the fat, triglycerides in the blood go way up. Fat starts to accumulate in the liver and the pancreas. And you have fatty liver, fatty pancreas. and insulin resistance, right? That's really what the main root cause of insulin resistance is, running out of storage in your fat cells. And the key about this that really explains the insulin resistance phenomena across the spectrum, if you have very few fat cells genetically, you can become type 2 diabetic at 120 pounds. And we've seen these people, very low weight, but they're type 2 diabetic. And then you can have somebody who's 100 pounds overweight and they have no signs of insulin resistance. They have normal A1Cs because they have a lot of fat cells, and they're not enough of those fat cells are stuffed yet. So that it creates this sort of point on your body of how much body fat I can gain before I become insulin resistant, and too many of these fat cells are stuffed. So that's kind of what I would call the root cause of insulin resistance.
Yeah, yeah. I'd love to talk a little bit more about that before we move on to carbohydrates and things like that. But
Yeah.
This is a really important topic, and it's one that, as you said, doesn't get enough attention, I believe. We focus a lot on the liver, and I think it's important to look at the liver. But oftentimes, I guess I differ a little bit in my opinion, and would say that this is a major driver. I think there's different paths that people can take to type 2 diabetes and metabolic dysfunction, but I think this path is a very significant path and probably the most common one. So we definitely agree there. And that is that we overfill our fat cells, as you said. The fat cells become swollen, hypertrophic is the term,
Yep.
and they become inflamed and insulin resistant. We actually just started measuring this a couple of years ago, looking at adiponectin and leptin levels. Yeah. And you can see, when we're not eating, when we're fasting, leptin should be super low. It should be like around 10 or less. And you can see people who have insulin resistant fat cells, their leptin levels will be like 50, 60, 80, sometimes over 100 when they're fasting. So their fat cells at that point are screaming, stop, feeding me, stop giving me so much energy. But the brain, of course, doesn't get that signal because they're leptin resistant.
Yep.
And that's something that is never measured. I mean, we talk about doctors don't measure insulin. Leptin isn't even measured by, holistic functional medicine doctors, and nobody's measuring leptin hardly except for like research scientists. So, but this is something that I think is important to look at because, as you've made a really good point of, and I'll let you talk more about it, is that those overfilled fat cells leak free fatty acids. Then they go into the liver, cause the liver to become insulin resistant. They, cause all sorts of problems to the body. And that, again, as you've said, I think is the primary driver of whole body insulin resistance, which leads to type 2 diabetes.
Yeah, exactly. And then, I mean, obviously there's many contributing factors to insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome. Everything from, I've seen studies showing insulin resistance of the cells doubling just by sleep deprivation, and those kind of things that are so important as well. So there's definitely lots of factors, but as far as the whole metabolic breakdown that happens in the body where the fat starts to accumulate where it shouldn't, and you got triglycerides that are sky high and these kind of problems, most of that originates in the fat cells. In the fat cells being just too much energy is being stored and not enough place to store more.
And you made a great point there that you don't need to be obese. A lot of people will think, oh, but I'm not fat, I'm not overweight. But, you could have and this is where the term you mentioned, personal fat threshold, comes in, because you can have the genetics or the physiology, the biology, whatever the phenotype, that you don't store a lot of fat. You don't have the capacity to store a lot of fat in your fat cells. And so, as you mentioned, you fill up the ones that you do have, and then you're in trouble. So
yeah, and the kind of paradox with that is that it's kind of absolutely the opposite of what, from an ancestral standpoint, was beneficial. Back in our early days, early humans, The ones that could make a lot of fat cells and store it, they lasted longer. They made it through those tough winters. And the ones that couldn't store a lot of body fat, they didn't fare very well back in those days because they couldn't store enough energy to make it through the long winter. Today, it's the opposite, right? You look at that person who can eat whatever they want, and they don't seem to gain much weight, body fat, as being beneficial. Like, look at them, they can eat whatever they want. They don't gain weight. And today it's kind of opposite, but there comes a downside to that in that, and we've had these people as clients that because you don't get that immediate, in the mirror response to the overconsumption, like getting fat, getting big, because you don't see that in the mirror, you're not as likely to take action on the diet or the lifestyle to change it, right? And so we've had women that were 110 pounds and type 2 diabetic, and on top of it, because they've let it go for so long and they ate whatever they wanted, they burned out their beta cells, and now they're also type 1.5 or whatever you want to call it. They aren't producing sufficient insulin either, and so this woman, she was a wreck. I mean, she was having seizures and she was, all these problems, but it never showed up on her body. And so, we're kind of a vain society. If we don't see it in the mirror, we don't take as much action on it. But yeah, it's a big problem. Obviously in different cultures, it's a little bit of the Asian paradox is related to this. Is from genetic standpoint, a lot of Japanese, Asian people have a smaller personal fat threshold. They have less body fat, and that's part of that whole paradox as well.
Yeah, so then this is why something like liposuction famously doesn't change metabolic health, because you can suck out all that subcutaneous fat and it doesn't really make that much of a difference because
it actually makes things worse.
It makes things worse, you're right, because now you have less fat cells.
Lowering your personal fat threshold. So
right.
Now, as you've basically reduced your metabolic flexibility because you can gain less body fat before becoming insulin resistant because you have less fat cells to fill up.
Yeah, there's an interesting phenomenon happening. We're seeing sort of a resurgence of a drug called Actos, and I think it's because of this Dr. Ralph DeFranzo, who's a brilliant scientist, researcher, who loves this medication. And he loves it because it's the only drug really that makes us more insulin sensitive. But the way it makes us more insulin sensitive is by causing us to grow new fat cells.
Yeah.
And so it sort of solves the problem that we're talking about here. The problem is it causes a lot of weight gain. And while that is protective in the short term, if you don't tie that with some healthy eating strategies, then you just fill up those new fat cells and you just keep gaining weight, and you can store fat around the heart, and it leads to a bunch of other problems. So his solution, of course, then is to combine that with a GLP-1, receptor agonist to suppress appetite. But, this polypharmacy rarely is what people want, and it rarely works the way you want it to. So it's just interesting that we're talking about this. And I've had, like, out of the blue, 3 or 4 clients in the last 60 days who are on, these drugs that sort of were phased out years ago. And I think that's one of the reasons why. But it's interesting to understand the mechanism and see how all this ties together.
Yeah, absolutely. And, at the end of the day, the big takeaway is you don't want less fat cells. You just want small, happy fat cells. A small fat cell, there's more adiponectin is put out in the body. There's thousands of studies related to adiponectin and how it reduces, elevated levels, because the fat cells, when they're small and happy, they put out more adiponectin. And so there's all these, the liver, the pancreas, all these studies that have looked at different body parts and mechanisms that show that more adiponectin means lower inflammation, lower fibrosis, and all these, problems that occur. It's the opposite when the adiponectin is high. So basically, if the fat cell's small and happy, the metabolism in the body is in much better shape, and that should be our goal. While
Yeah, yeah.
simultaneously maintaining or growing muscle, and that's the other. Those two, to me, insulin resistance is hand in hand with shrinking the fat cells, making them small and happy, while maintaining and growing muscle to make sure that you have places to store glucose. So the
Right.
more muscle you have, the more storage you have for glucose.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in complete agreement with that. I think that's really the key for almost everyone. Like you said, there are some cases where sleep is the major issue, or they're just under such chronic stress that it's driving up their cortisol or something. But for this metabolic dysfunction path towards type 2 diabetes or insulin resistance or both, I really think this is the key. And it sounds simple, but of course, the trick is making it work for you and being able to put in place the behavior change that's going to allow you to do that. So we'll talk about that in a little bit, maybe on the other half of the podcast here. But let's get back to the carbohydrate thing, because for years it was just eat low carb or keto, and I know carnivore, whatever. You guys have written many books about this, but I think it's a little bit more complicated. So lean into that a little bit.
Yeah, our keto or our methods have always been a little different than the mainstream, and it's for this reason. And so if you look at like the carbohydrate insulin model, basically what it says is that if you eat too much carbohydrates, you elevate insulin, and that elevated insulin locks fat in storage and doesn't allow you to burn it as easily, and it kind of keeps you in a storage mode, etc. But there's a couple of, I could talk about it just common sense, basic, understanding examples, as well as mechanistically. The first, just right off the top, every study that you look at, there's two kind of insulins, right? There's fasting insulin. So insulin when you haven't eaten anything, you're in a fasted state. That baseline insulin level, that's always there, basal insulin. And then there's insulin that occurs with meals to utilize those and store those fuels and proteins that are coming in. So those are post-meal, postprandial, insulin transients. So if you look at the two types of insulin responses, the baseline insulin, basal insulin, if you look at, there's been studies on this, and you look at type 1s. Type 1s are a great way to study insulin because you know exactly how much is required to keep things in check. You have to administer it all, right? And so you can measure exactly how much is being administered, taken. And so people eating a low-carb diet that were type 1s, about 70 to 80% of the insulin required during the course of the day was for basal insulin. So that background insulin, just to keep keep your body, mechanistically, it's basically to keep the fat in the fat cells and keep your body from just spewing out in the urine glucose and everything. It's holding back fuels as much as it's storing them. Okay, that's one of the mechanistic parts of insulin that is important to understand. But what's interesting too is that basal insulin level, being that it's the most of your insulin during the course of a day for most people, if you lose body fat, your basal insulin, your fasting insulin comes down. It's well understood. You look at any study, as you lose body fat, as you lose weight, fasting insulin comes down. So if the carbohydrate insulin model was correct, and lower insulin means it's easier to burn fat because insulin's lower, shouldn't that first 10 pounds of weight loss be the hardest? Because fasting insulin's the highest, right? As you lose body fat, let's say you lose 20 pounds, shouldn't the next 20 pounds be easier? Because insulin's now lower. Fasting insulin's decreased. So shouldn't the next 20 be easier? And the next 20 be even easier? And that last 20 be the easiest because insulin's lowest? It's the opposite. We all know that the exact opposite is true, right? The first 20 is fairly easy, then it gets tougher, and that last 20 or last 10 pounds is really hard. And it's the reason is you're becoming more insulin sensitive, right? So back to the fat cells, as you lose body fat, right? So when they're stuffed, When you're at that obese state, they're stuffed. They don't want to take it. So it's actually harder to store fat at that point. It's going to accumulate in your liver in places you don't want it. But as you shrink the fat cells and lose body fat, now the fat cells are happier because they're smaller. And they're like, okay, I can take up some fat if you eat a little more than you need, right? So the storage capacity increased because you shrunk the fat cell, so there's more place to store. So that's why it becomes harder to lose weight because you're actually getting more insulin sensitive. And so that is kind of a mechanistic example of why that whole theory just doesn't hold water. But if you look at it from again, back to what the body's doing, type 1 diabetics, it'll often be said in the people that promote that if you have no insulin, like a type 1, they can't store fat and they can't keep on weight, right? And that's true. But that's the difference of no insulin to some insulin. On a normal functioning human pancreas, anybody who's not type 1 diabetic, you always have some insulin around. And that some insulin is enough to store fat. You don't even need a transient of insulin to store fat in your fat cells. The baseline basal insulin of your body is enough to store fat in your fat cells.
How do you look at the post-meal insulin? Because this is where we'll see a lot of problems, I think. And the fasting insulin does vary a lot, but the post-meal insulin really varies. I mean, you'll see people early in the process, for example, of insulin resistance and metabolic dysfunction, their insulin will go sky high after meals, especially, sort of a high carb or standard American meal could go well over 100. And then that starts to diminish. So oftentimes by the time someone's type 2 diabetic, they're not getting that huge post-meal spike. Sometimes they still are, but oftentimes that'll start to go down. And of course, that's why their blood sugar will go up so high after meals. One of the reasons. They're also highly insulin resistant. So whatever insulin they are making isn't working all that well, or isn't doing the job at the level of the muscle, especially as well as it should. But how do you look at that in regards to what you were just talking about? Because you talked a lot about fasting insulin and how that comes down as we lose weight and burn more fat. How do you look at the post-meal insulin?
So the primary problem I have with post-meal insulin isn't normal insulin response to food. It's the composition of the food you're eating that causes an exaggerated response, right? And so, our bodies, and this is where in this low carb community, people also get a little too upset. They'll wear like a CGM and then they'll be like, oh my gosh, I just did a HIIT workout and my glucose went from 90 to 180. Should I stop working out? We've had those people ask us, because they get so focused on that insulin response and glucose level. But no, that was probably insulin going down a bit to allow more fuel into the bloodstream to fuel the workout, right? So that's actually a good thing, and that's exactly what the body is trying to do. The pancreas, I look at as more of a fuel regulator on the bloodstream, right? It's constantly adjusting the volume of fuel in the bloodstream at any given time based on the demand. And so in a lot of ways, insulin is like this net on your fat cells holding back fat into the fat cells so to keep it from flooding the bloodstream and putting too much fat into the bloodstream that you don't need right now. It's basically the brakes on lipolysis, right? Lipolysis is the process of the body pulling fat from the fat cells and using it as fuel. Well, insulin acts as a brake on that to slow it down based on a current demand or need, right? And when you eat something, guess what happens? Lots of fuel's coming in to the bloodstream, and unless you're eating while running a marathon, a lot of that's got to get stored away. So what's pancreas going to do? I don't have a lot of demand for fuel right now, and I got a lot coming in. I got to store that away. So you're going to get a spike in insulin to store off the fuels from the bloodstream, so you don't have too much fuel in the bloodstream. And if you look at, there's something called oxidative priority, where the body will prioritize the different fuels coming in. And it's really you can look at it one of two ways. either reverse order of toxicity or reverse order of storage capacity. They both kind of work out. And for this discussion, kind of ignore protein, because protein doesn't really get used as a fuel unless it's kind of a fuel of last resort. You don't have any other fuels around. So it really comes down to alcohol is the number one oxidative priority because there's no place to store it. And it's the most toxic fuel. If you get too much alcohol in the blood, you die. So the body has to prioritize that and burn that first. And if that meal also had carbohydrates and fats, well, the carbohydrates are the next priority because too high a blood glucose is also dangerous and can kill you. But you do have some storage capacity for glucose, right? You've got maybe 2,000 calories as glycogen in your muscle and liver for storing glucose. Where alcohol, there was no storage. So, kind of going in the reverse order of, toxicity or storage. And the last priority is fat, because you can handle a lot of fat in the blood. Again, too much chronically can be bad for your health and problems, but not like, instant death of, too much alcohol kind of situation. And fat has the largest storage capacity, right? There's people with millions of calories of fat on their body walking around. So the body, you and I sitting here right now, our entire blood volume for any fuel, fat, ketones, free fatty acids, that's obviously fat, and glucose, any of those fuels, it's like 100 calories in our entire blood volume. So you eat a big meal, 500, 800, 1,000 calories, and that's all flooding into the bloodstream. The body's got to do the prioritize things, store things off. That's insulin doing its job, keeping your bloodstream from getting toxic and doing its job. Well, guess what happens so that's kind of the normal one. That's I'm okay with all of that process, right? What happens when you eat highly processed foods, grains, sugars? Our bodies aren't used to that. Our bodies, there's no evolutionary period, 1,000, 5,000 years ago where we would go out, walk around and find something and eat it that had, 1,000 calorie flurry worth of sugar and fat in it simultaneously, right? That didn't exist. And so that flood, and it's highly absorbable, the processed grains and the sugars, they get in the bloodstream extremely fast. They get absorbed straight in. And so the pancreas now is in panic mode, right? Because glucose is spiking like mad. And so what does it do? It spikes insulin big time to try to drive it back down quick before it kills you. What always happens is overcorrection. And so that glucose just drops rapidly because of the huge spike in insulin, and then it dips too low. What happens when it drops fast and dips too low? You get hungry. Hunger hormones are driven because, now I'm in danger of having too little glucose in the bloodstream because it's crashing, right? And so hunger hormones are triggered. Even 2 hours ago you had 1,000 calorie flurry, right? Now you eat 1,000 calorie of eggs, you're probably not going to eat again for a day. Where that 1,000 calorie flurry, 2 hours later you could eat again. You're hungry, and so that's the bad cycle of postprandial, post-meal insulin, is when it's that exaggerated spike from super high glucose meals.
Okay, so you still, even though maybe it's not for the same reasons that we once thought, or at least a large part of the low carb community once thought, but you still recommend avoiding processed refined carbs. You still recommend a lower carb, or even keto or carnivore type diet, just for different reasons. Is that?
Yeah. So that's the main reason, is that cycle of hunger. And what happens with the cycle of hunger? You eat more, you eat too much, you start filling up your fat cells. I mean, it's the weight gain and obesity cycle. It's basically the standard American diet, right?
Right.
That processed, high, low nutrient. And that's the other part of it, is even going back 15, 20 years, we've always promoted a whole foods approach. So eating, none of these processed foods, not even the keto processed foods. It's all junk. Just stick with whole foods, and prioritize protein. And that has always been our what we promote going all along. And the big part of that is because protein is key for so many reasons. Number one, it drives a lot of satiety. protein is one of the most satiating per calorie that thing that you can eat. Number two, whole foods, animal proteins are loaded with vitamins and minerals. In this book, when we wrote this like 8 years ago, I put a whole chapter in there of the vitamins and minerals in different foods because it wasn't common knowledge. You give somebody a plate with a steak, some kale, and some blueberries, and you ask them, where are your vitamins and minerals? Most people probably say the kale or maybe the blueberries. Well, it's the steak. The steak's got the most vitamins and minerals of most foods you eat. And so prioritizing protein, you get lots of vitamins and minerals the body needs. You get the protein your body needs every day to, build new hair, skin, nails, autophagy, turnover of cells and amino acids that are daily required for all these processes, maintaining muscle. So protein gives you that, vitamins and minerals. That should be the starting point of every plate you eat. Now, what you add to that, there's, from a mechanistic standpoint, you want to add carbs or fat, not both, right? Again, oxidative priority, and there's something called Randall cycle where if you just look at carbs and fat, the more carbs you eat, the less fat you oxidize. The less carbs you eat, the more fat you oxidize. So you burn more fat. And so you want one or the other. You don't want both because then as you burn the carbs, you just store all the fat. And so for our standpoint, we find that the people that we work with history of obesity and issues, adding fat instead of more carbs works better for us because it gives you more of that stable energy. You don't get those crashes from high carb meals where you might drive a hunger cycle.
Yeah, and for people with diabetes, especially, or who are highly insulin resistant, like at this time, I still think fruit is not a great idea in the short term because it is gonna drive up the blood sugar if you can't tolerate that amount of glucose. I mean, there probably is a path to where you could eat fruit at some point once you become more metabolically flexible and not as glucose intolerant, but fat doesn't have that same effect. It can affect insulin resistance in a negative way if you overeat fat, but it's not going to spike your blood sugar, certainly. And so, and as you mentioned, all blood sugar spikes are not created equal. If your blood sugar jumps up 50 points and it's back down within 20 minutes, maybe not that big of a deal, but but we do want to try to keep a stable blood sugar as much as we can. And I think, absolutely agree. Prioritizing protein is key. And then adding in probably mostly fat is next. But I also agree that it should be whole food based. So, we're not adding a bunch of oil or even butter for that. I mean, not that you can't use butter, but I think we should eat the fat that comes with the food, first,
Exactly.
and that's, I think we're going to be a lot safer if we do it that way. It is easy to over consume fat calories. And I hate to bring up the C word, but if we overeat energy from any source, fat or carbs, and we're not metabolically healthy and we're not burning that energy, we're going to have problems. So we do need to be a little bit careful, but if we get the fat from our food rather than adding it to our food, I think we're probably going to be pretty safe.
Exactly. And this is a little bit of a problem in the carnivore community is, a lot of them promote, just eat the fattiest cuts of meats and cover everything in butter and eat sticks of butter. And, if you're like a lot of those influencers, if you're 6'2" and a man and you get a lot of muscle, that's probably going to be fine for you. Right? If you do that same thing and you're an obese middle-aged woman, it's not going to work out so great. And we get people daily coming to us saying, I'm just gaining weight. I'm gaining, fat doing this method. And we just do exactly what you said. Just cut out the added fats and butters and, stick with what you get. Maybe one of those meals, switch out to a leaner protein source, and bring the fat down a bit more. And it works great, and they start shedding weight. You can definitely overeat fat, even with zero carbohydrate, and that kind of goes back to disproving the carbohydrate-insulin model, right? If it's all about high carbs driving weight gain, if carbs are low, you should never be able to gain body fat, right? If carbs are really low in the diet, well, we have people eating zero carbohydrate, eating carnivore, and they're gaining weight. And it's because they're adding the sticks of butter and all the things that promote just getting too much fat in the diet. We've even had one guy that came to us who he said all the influencers he talked to in carnivore were telling him he must be lying or just trying to make carnivore look bad, because he was doing all that and his triglycerides shot through the roof and his glucose went way up. What was happening? Because he had a low personal fat threshold. So he's one of these people who genetically didn't have a lot of fat cells. So what happens when you're dumping a bunch of fat in the diet? There's no place to put it. So triglycerides go way up. And insulin's load is now way higher because all this fat's in the blood and he's trying to deal with all that. So glucose is also going to go higher. And now you've got this insulin resistant state happening even though you're eating zero carbohydrates, right? And so that's the thing that you have to be careful of. And it comes back to, what's insulin's real role? Its real role is just controlling regulating the amount of fuel that's in the bloodstream and storing off the excess fuel or allowing more out when you have an exercise or something that requires it.
Yeah, definitely. And I like that you said maybe even eat leaner proteins for a particular meal. You and I have talked about protein sparing modified fast in the past. I know you guys have a book about that as well, and I do also. And one of the things that I think that can be helpful for is, I talked earlier about leptin resistance, and a lot of people just have a sort of a broken satiety mechanism. Like not that it's broken forever, but it's not working all that well. So while prioritizing protein is still a great strategy, sometimes that's not enough. Sometimes you can't just eat to satiety and be in balance. Sometimes you have to use some sort of, I don't like the word hack, but you have to use some sort of system to control the amount of food that's coming in. I'm not a huge fan of these GLP-1 drugs, but they definitely work and they help people lose weight. We'll see what the long-term effect of that type of approach is, and I don't know that it's sustainable, certainly not without staying on the drug forever for most people, but we can say that, okay, they thought they were controlling what they were eating. Not everybody, but a lot of people thought they were already controlling what they're eating. They go on a medication, and now, and a lot of these people said, I can't lose weight no matter what I do. I can eat low carb, I can eat keto, and I just can't lose weight. They go on this medication and lose weight. So it's, there's something in there that wasn't allowing them to control their appetite on their own. They were eating more than they thought they were eating, whatever. And so there are natural ways, of course, to do that also. Eating more protein, it can be helpful, but having a structured meal or two, like you mentioned, where we're purposely trying to cut down on the energy we're consuming, I think can also be important.
Exactly. And you point out a really good point about, again, just eat the fattiest cuts and eat until you're full. Doesn't work for a lot of people because of the leptin resistance that they have. And a lot of this largely goes in hand with the overstuffed fat cells and obesity. That drives the leptin resistance and elevated leptin. So, a lot of these people that come to us with obesity or morbid obesity are leptin resistant as well. And you have to, like you said, drive them past that point. Start to reverse that leptin resistance by shrinking their fat cells and getting the hormones back in line. And a great way to do that quickly is a protein sparing modified fast. And that's what the method we've used with it to make it a little more of a tool and something that you can use when needed is we have people do protein sparing days like 1 to maybe 3 days a week. And then if they're doing that like every week, we tell them to add in like a maintenance day, or overfeeding day, just to keep the metabolism honest and you're not eating too much of a deficit constantly. But yeah, it's a great tool. It breaks stalls. It gets it, like you said, gets them into that structured meal mindset so that they're losing body fat without having to worry about the leptin issues and all that that's driving so much hunger for them.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that. That's something that we've sort of started to gravitate towards also, is sort of cycling on and off with maybe 3 or 4 or 5 days, usually 3 or 4 days of that energy restricted, prioritizing protein, eating low carb, low fat for those 3 or 4 days, and then taking whatever 20 days off or sometimes just 10 days off and then going again. Some people do
Yeah.
better on the continuous. Like some people find that, if they can just get past day 3 or 4, they're fine. And then they like to stay on that and they can be really consistent. And then others, I think, do better when they cycle. So you kind of have to try different things and learn what works for you. But it is a really good approach. So you said that the goal is changing body composition, building muscle, emptying the fat cells, making the fat cells more metabolically flexible, insulin sensitive, able to store fat. And we talked about a couple different ways to do that. You talked about prioritizing protein, eating a high satiety diet, whole food diet. What are some other methods, or what are some of the other key strategies that you use to help people get to that place where they're more metabolically healthy?
Yeah, I think again, the metabolically healthy is really about having storage capacity for fats and glucose, right? It's the more storage capacity, the available storage area for each of those you have, the more metabolically flexible you are, because the pancreas can quickly shuffle off those fuels when they come in, right, and keep things totally happy. On the muscle side, the carbohydrate side, that means more muscle. You can store it in your liver, but everybody's liver is roughly the same amount of storage capacity. The variable is going to be how much muscle you have, and the more muscle you have, the more storage, right? And so strength training, prioritizing protein, of course, shrinking the fat cells and getting storage capacity there. The thing that really helps on that side is cutting all dairy and nuts. Dairy and nuts are one of those things on a low carb approach people kind of get tripped up on because they're so easy to overdo. Dairy is one of those things that just doesn't drive satiety like other foods. There's even been studies on different foods and their satiety, and the one study I was looking at, dairy and nuts were the top two that didn't drive as much satiety as the other foods. And it is true. You take a handful of cashews and you eat them. You could grab another handful and eat them. You could probably grab another handful and there's just no satiety stopping you. It's just one of those foods, and dairy's kind of a lot that way too. Another piece of cheese, another piece of cheese. It just doesn't drive the same satiety. So cutting 100% of the dairy and nuts, not even butter, cream, none of it, really helps with weight loss. So that's kind of the body fat side of things. And then of course, using tools like protein sparing modified fast to speed up the fat loss will help as well.
Yeah, that's great advice, and something that I used to talk about more. I probably need to start talking about it again. But dairy and nuts are both growth foods, right? I mean, they're both foods that are designed to either grow a baby plant or grow a baby cow. And if unless you want to grow, unless you're trying to gain weight and gain fat, especially fat mass, those probably aren't the best choices. So,
Yeah.
Because, baby animals get fat on milk, and, I don't know about plants, but plants grow, there's a lot of energy in nuts. So, they use that to really fuel a new, a new plant, a new being. So these are foods that probably shouldn't be in our diet if we're trying to burn fat, lose weight, become more metabolically
Exactly.
healthy, and get rid of
Yeah.
some of our fat energy.
You're exactly right. The milk is to fatten up the baby, and the nuts are really, if you look at, especially where we live typically in Wisconsin here, we're in Hawaii for a little bit in the winter, but in Wisconsin, you look around and one of the only things in nature that has high carbs and high fat, again, high carbs and fat together, the carbs make all that fat get stored away. It's like the great fattening foods.
Right.
One of the only things out there in nature with high carbs and high fat are acorns. Well, guess what
Right.
acorns do? They fatten up the squirrels, they fatten up the deer. They,
Oh yeah.
in the fall when we have lots of oak trees, those acorns, they're gobbling them up like crazy and getting layer fat for the winter. That's what their purpose is, really.
Yeah. Great stuff. So before we started recording, we mentioned one other thing that we want to talk about, and this is going to be a little bit of a tangent, but it's creatine. And I said I'd love to talk about it because I feel like it's kind of making a comeback. And
Yeah.
a lot of our audience, I don't think, is all that familiar with creatine and probably not using it. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about it.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I've recently, there's been some recent studies coming out, and I've been diving into it a little bit more. Traditionally, creatine is like the bodybuilders, right? They use it for building muscle, and of all the supplements out there, the one that consistently is shown to help with muscle growth is creatine. And this isn't just bodybuilders. If you're over 60, muscle is really hard to maintain and build. And so, having more muscle as we age keeps us strong, keeps us from becoming frail. So, everybody should be excited about building muscle. But it's not just for muscle. And some of the studies that are coming out are really impressive around other things that creatine is helpful for. Couple of the recent ones I was looking at looked at creatine amounts in the diet and associations with depression. And there was a stepwise decrease in depression symptoms or depression cases with increased creatine intake. So it was completely a ramp. The more creatine they had, the less depression. And there's a few other studies on that associated with depression and creatine supplementation showing, stepwise. So the more creatine, the less depression symptoms, which is pretty impressive. There's not a lot of things you can say that about from a supplement standpoint. So I think there's a lot of potential there. I've also even seen some really interesting studies around sleep with creatine as well. There was I can't remember the exact name of the study, but it was looking at sleep deprivation and supplementing with creatine after some sleep deprivation. Supplementing creatine actually kind of reversed the symptoms of it. So, if you look at the symptoms of sleep deprivation, it reversed most of the symptoms of sleep deprivation just by adding creatine. So I think there's that aspect as well as better sleep using it. So I think there's a lot of little things about creatine. It's always been kind of this, bodybuilder space, but I think there's a lot more to it that's beneficial, and we're just starting to kind of tap into that.
So if somebody wants to start taking creatine and they're not doing it now, what's the best way to take it? What form does it come in? Is there a particular type of creatine that you like?
Yeah, so a lot of these studies, they'll look at loading, and initially, so like the first week or so, you do like 10 to 20 grams of creatine a day, and then after that week, you go to like 5 grams a day, and to kind of maintain things. And during that loading period, they'll see increases in the brain of creatine levels, and then that 5 grams a day kind of maintains those levels. It's kind of like a loading period. But yeah, I think generally, they typically talk around 5 grams a day, but that's traditionally what we've looked at, and some of these studies, especially like around depression, these ones were showing the more they used, the better it got. So I don't think we fully understand what the doses might be for those different kind of conditions. So definitely going to be watching for more data and information on that.
And do you take it as a powder typically?
Yeah, we actually do. Create has these little packets. I'll actually just grab it right here.
Sure.
It's kind of it's almost like an electrolyte. So you got this little packet with 5 grams, right, of creatine. You can put it in a drink before a workout. They have, flavors. They have stevia and different flavorings, and it makes it really convenient.
Okay, nice. Yeah, so if you've never used creatine and you're trying to build some muscle and you want to see some of those other benefits, then give it a try. It's
Yeah,
something that has a lot of evidence actually behind it, and most people, at least most of our audience, just isn't using it. So something
exactly.
that you could consider adding. All right, great. So much information here, Craig. I know that you guys love to teach and you love to share. You and Maria have just tons of books and resources and things that you have made available to people. If people want to, follow some of your work, want to learn more from you, what's the best place or best way for them to do that?
The easiest way is to go to ketomaria.com. It's a website I put together that links to everything, links to all our social media accounts, links, YouTube, links to our website, blog, everything. And then if we have some great support packages and options, weekly coaching calls and these kind of things and support groups, that's at keto-adapted.com. And you can get all our ebooks there and all that kind of stuff too.
All right, awesome. So keto-adapted.com
Dash.
and ketomaria.com.
Yep, those are the best to get to everything.
Perfect. Perfect. All right. What a great conversation. I always love spending time with you. Thanks so much for sharing all of that with us here today on the Mastering Blood Sugar podcast.
Thanks, Brian. It was awesome catching up with you.
Yeah. All right. Take care, everybody. We'll see you next time.